is a pretty rowdy class. I like it. So, thanks so much for having me here today, the Board of Trustees, Dr. O'Brien, the faculty administration. Most of all, you graduating students and your lovely families. It's a pleasure to be part of this event today. When I first accepted this invitation a few months ago, the first thing I did was sit down and try to write a speech. That didn't go so well. I found myself looking at each manuscript thinking this seems rather uninspiring and sounds a lot like other graduation speeches I'd been a witness to, which I couldn't remember all that well. And after trying many, many times, I thought, rather than actually read a speech to you, what I would do today is just tell you my story. And hope that maybe in my own life experience, things I've been through, you might find something for yourself that is interesting or motivating or maybe even inspiring to take with you as you leave today and head off on the next chapter of your lives. And if I can accomplish even a little bit of that for some of you, I'll feel like my mission is accomplished up here. So I did my undergraduate work at Stanford, and I was a poli-sci major in college, which actually is something I did by accident. Political science is Stanford's shortest major. And I was coming to the end of my junior year, and graduation was not that far away, and I sat down to look at my transcript to figure out, how am I going to graduate from here? I had really spent the first 3 years experimenting, trying a whole bunch of different things, and really wanted to sort of try out different ideas as a student. And looking down on my transcript, I realized I'm not that far away from a poli-sci major. I just need a handful of more courses to complete that and be able to graduate. And so I scouted around for some courses, and I landed on a course taught by a professor named Jim March. The course was called Organizational Leadership. And it looked very intriguing, so I signed up for it and took this class. And in many ways, the class looked a lot like a very typical class on organizational behavior and leadership. But in hindsight, I think this class was really a class about life masquerading as that topic. I think Jim March really used this class to try to impart to his students a different perspective on how to make choices and how to live your life. And his, it kind of boils down to something relatively simple, which was, do something because it has meaning to you. Do something because you find it beautiful, is how he would say it. And not because of the reward that it brings you. Do it because it has intrinsic meaning to you. And that idea was brought to life through a handful of characters that we studied in great novels, among them Joan of Arc, War and Peace, and Don Quixote. In some ways, Don Quixote is kind of the quintessential character who lives this life that has meaning for him and kind of only him. He leads a somewhat absurd life from the perspective of everyone around him. Joan of Arc spoke to God, and she was burned at the stake for it. And he, through these characters, really talked about the notion of heresy, of heretics, of people that chose paths that were a little unusual, but they did it for what it meant to them. And for some reason, that idea really took for me. It came to me at the right time in my life, and it really resonated for me. And so the final came around that year, and it was a very typical final. It had a bunch of short answer questions that were all pulled from the literature, and we were meant to fill out all these blue books to answer this final. And rather than answer any of the questions on the final, I decided to write an essay of my own that I called Heresy. I completely ignored the questions on the final and submitted my document. It was, for me, this great moment of kind of my personal manifesto of individuality and sort of picking my path. I handed it in, I went away on the break, and I came back eagerly anticipating my transcript, and I went to the registrar to pick it up. This is when you actually had transcripts on paper, believe it or not. And I looked down at the transcript, and I had a D- in organizational leadership, which crushed me. And with tears literally on my face, I beelined straight to Jim's office. And I walked in the door, and as soon as he saw me, he said, Sit down, Tim. I think maybe we've taken this Don Quixote thing a little bit too far. I'm really proud of what you've done. I'm really glad you did it. But I think for me to honor that, the only thing that I can do is to really act as the mainstream society institution would do, which is to ask whether you've answered the questions and grade you accordingly, and you didn't answer anything I asked you. So you have an F. And you were doing well going into the final, so you rounded up to a D-. Took me a few minutes, but I went from sort of being despairing to actually quite euphoric about it. It remains the proudest grade on my transcript, a D- in organizational leadership. It's kind of an unfortunate grade to have on your transcript for that particular class, although I've never shown my transcript to anybody since I graduated college. And that experience of mine really sort of propelled me out of college. When I graduated school, I had sort of become determined to really do something because it brought meaning to me, not because of the reward it would bring me, what my parents expected of me, what the school did, or what I was supposed to, what a guy of my background was supposed to do. I just was looking for my passion, which was music. And I had played piano since I was a small child, and through college I'd done a lot of music. I'd studied it, I'd written music, and when I graduated, I knew that I wanted to be involved in music in some capacity. But I wasn't sure how I'd make money at it. So the first job I got out of college was a nanny. I was a nanny. For 5 years, that was my first job. Actually, the proper term for that is a manny. Kids are a lifelong passion of mine as well. And for the first 5 years after school, my life consisted of getting up in the morning, sitting down at the piano and playing until about 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and heading off to this elementary school and picking up these 2 boys, 9 and 10-year-old kids, bringing them home and making sure they did their homework, hanging out in the street for a little wiffle ball with the neighborhood kids, and then cooking dinner for them, and then coming home and sitting back down on the piano again, playing for another 4 or 5 hours before I went to sleep. So I did that for a few years. I really woodshedded as a piano player. Got deep into music and technology. It was really exploding at the time, but I was really leading a very unusual but fulfilling life for myself. And eventually I segued out of this career and began performing as a musician in rock bands. Lived out of a van for a while, traveled the sort of western United States, and got a taste of sort of the world of the working musician, and then eventually became a film composer. So I started writing music for picture, for really any kind of film I could get my hands on, be it a student short film or a commercial, whatnot. I eventually did some feature film scores, not for any film you would have ever heard of, but some small indie stuff. And was kind of clawing my way up the ladder in that profession. And as a film composer, my primary job was to figure out what a director wanted for their film. And I had developed this system where I would sit down with the director and we'd watch the locked picture, the completed picture that had just sound effects and dialogue on it. And I would bring with me a stack of CDs. And as we watched the movie, I would play songs for them. And I would get their feedback to the music, their sort of thumbs up, thumbs down. And as we went through that interview, I could develop sort of an idea of what their taste was, something of a taxonomy of their taste, what they liked about the music and what would work for the movie for them. So I could go back to my recording studio and write something that they would like. And I did this for years, for a number of years, and got pretty good at being able to profile someone's taste. And then one day, it was 1999, I read an article in a newspaper that triggered an idea for me, which was to try to codify this musical taste taxonomy and build a recommendation tool, a recommendation engine. This is 1999. I don't even want to think about how young you were at that time. But it was the very height of the first big .com consumer wave, and there was a lot of entrepreneurial energy in Silicon Valley. And I shared this idea with a friend of mine, which was to create what we ultimately called the Music Genome Project, which is a gigantic database that is essentially made up of hundreds of attributes that describe a piece of music. So I broke down songs into their component parts, every dimension of melody and harmony and rhythm and form and instrumentation and voice, etc. There are now about 450 of those attributes. And the idea was to actually have musicians sit down, analyze songs one at a time manually and capture sort of the equivalent of musical DNA. And then by marrying that that musical attributing to math, be able to help build a discovery engine. You type in a song you knew, and math would go seeking other songs that had similar digital fingerprints, musical fingerprints. I shared the idea with a friend of mine who thought it was really intriguing and said, hey, let's see if we can start a company. I said, well, how do you do that? Well, you just need to write a business plan. Well, how do you do that? Well, I'll show you. So a week later, literally, we spent 2 days writing a business plan and then went out to try and raise some money for it. And within 2 months, we had $1.5 million from a bunch of insane investors to put money into what was a completely harebrained idea. It takes 15 or 20 minutes to analyze a 3-minute song and can take close to an hour to analyze a symphonic piece, and it's all manual, so it's really absurd. But we got this money to get started, and so suddenly we were in a small apartment in South San Francisco with a handful of computer scientists and a whole big group of musicians building the Music Genome Project. And it took us about a year to build a prototype for that. And after year one, we had analyzed about 20,000 songs, and we had entered them into a Microsoft Excel file. And our CTO, Will Glazer, had built a calculation, a program within the Excel macro that allowed us to take any of those 20,000 songs, type one in the search box, and hit this button that said rank. And it would calculate the distance from that starter song to every other song in our collection. So a year in, we give it its first spin. We type in a song by the Beatles. And it takes about 3 minutes for the macro to go through its computation, and we wait for it to kick out its answer. And the first song it pulls up is a Bee Gees song. We thought, oh shit, this thing doesn't work, you know? We're a year in, we've spent probably $1 million at this point in salaries, et cetera, and it turns out this whole idea was lost from the beginning. Turns out early Bee Gees was actually a great match for that song, and after listening to the audio, we realized, oh, actually this is really working. And it's also picked a song that no other engine would ever pick to match. This is great. So very excited, plowed ahead, but plowed into 2001, which is a completely different world than 1999. The whole .com euphoria had evaporated. And having tried to raise some money, we realized it was going to be tough to keep going. So we began asking our employees in the course of that year to start working for an ever smaller share of their salary in cash. Until by the end of 2001, we weren't paying anybody anything, which we called salary deferral back then. And about 50 people wound up working without getting paid for about 2 years on this idea, which is actually illegal in California, we learned later on. We couldn't afford an attorney, so we didn't know we were breaking the law. But a group of people kind of hung together, and for 2 years helped build this thing. And after 348 pitches to investment firms and 11 maxed out credit cards and about $500,000 of personal debt, I raised a second round of financing in 2004, $9 million that essentially resurrected the company. And about a year later, we took that same technology and completely repurposed it into this personalized radio product that we came to call Pandora and launched in... Thank you. Can I ask you, how many people here have actually used Pandora? All right, excellent. I hope it helped you through your studies sometimes. And it took off like a rocket ship. And it just exploded. And in a couple of years, it launched on smartphones. And before we knew it, the organization had gone from just a handful of people to now we have about 1,700 employees and about 50 offices in 3 countries. And thanks. Given where we've been, I look around and feel sort of an out-of-body experience often when I walk around our offices because it's such an unlikely outcome. The chances of Pandora actually being alive today are virtually 0. But as we've grown and the company has become more mature and we've got a rich layer of senior managers, I've had some more time to sort of reflect back on this experience and done a lot of reading. And the book I read not that long ago, which I highly recommend to you, is a book called Stumbling on Happiness. It's a book by Daniel Gilbert, who's a sort of neuroscience psychology professor, Harvard, I believe. And his book has a very interesting take on human life and decision-making. And his theory is pretty straightforward. It's this, that and he actually shows this through human subjects research, that we are very bad at predicting what will make us happy in the future. So he does studies and he asks people to predict how they'll feel with certain events, and we're wrong, chronically wrong. And we're equally bad at remembering what made us happy in the past. So as we make decisions, turns out we're making all these great important life decisions on really, really bad data, because we have an idea of predicting what will make us happy, and we look back at the past and misremember what happened before us and use that to determine what targets and goals we set for ourselves. And this book really struck me. I thought to myself, you know, if that's true, how do I decide what to do? If I'm not very good at making a choice like that, how do I make a plan? And I'm thinking back on my own life. I had no plan whatsoever. You know, I had no idea what this company would turn into. When I graduated college, I was a nanny, for Christ's sake. You know, I was not on a vocational path. What I really did was I found something that I love to do, and I went after that. And I think that if you embrace Dr. Gilbert's ideas and this belief that it's very hard to accurately predict what's going to make you happy and what's made you happy in the past, then probably the best thing you can do is do something that you love now. And I'm guessing that a lot of you are very target-oriented right now. You've just crossed one of your first big targets, getting out of college or graduate school, like it's all undergrad today. But you've already thought about your next targets, and those targets will in turn be replaced by others. But keep in mind that you're not particularly good at figuring out what's going to make you happy. And I think what that means is it's really, really important to pay attention to what you love to do. And Dharti, I think, said that at the end of her comments, you know, find something that you love to do. Because I will say this, and this has become sort of a personal philosophy of mine, that my fear in life is not so much that I will seek something and fail and regret having tried that. The great fear I have is that I would live my life and have the regret of not having tried something that I love to do. And to me, that is a much more profound and incurable regret than one of having tried and failed. And I think that even if this company had become a big smoking hole in the ground, which it was well on its way to doing back in 2003, it would have been a long recovery. You know, when you're a musician, $500,000 in debt, usually you go to Mexico. You don't wind up returning to your highly lucrative band touring career to pay off that debt. So it would have been an unpleasant experience, but I don't think I would have regretted for a minute having tried it. So my advice to you today, is, as you look ahead, is really that simple. You know, spend some time paying attention to the things that really matter to you, that you really have a genuine passion for. You may not know that yet. It may take some time, but pay attention when that time comes. And pause and think about, is that something you want to go chase? Because I will say that in addition to this belief I have that if you do that, it's hard to have regrets, it also turns out that's a really good professional decision. Because nothing is more indicative of success. I think nothing will carry you through more challenge, as it did me, than doing something that you love to do. You know, when we spent 2 years working without salary, there were about 50 people. That was an awfully stressful experience, and I experienced insomnia months and months and months, and I had a lot of fear, but what really sustained me through that was just a passion and joy for what I was doing. So that's my advice to you today. Pay attention to your passions and give them a try, because if you do that, you will live a life without regret. So congratulations, and thank you for having me today.